Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 162 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is Dr. Mark Stout, who has held many positions both inside and outside the U.S. intelligence community. He's worked as an intelligence analyst for the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, for the CIA, and was a civilian employee for the U.S. Army at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. He was also the historian for the International Spy Museum from 2010 until 2013, and was the director of the Masters in Arts program for Global Security Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Former and founding president of the North American Society for Intelligence History. He's also authored and edited several books, and his articles have been published in many professional journals over the years. This is Mark's second appearance on the podcast. You may recall our earlier discussion in episode 44 about a little-known private U.S. intelligence organization called The Pond. I invited Mark back again to discuss his new book, World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence. But first, and for this week only, check out the amazing Stricktarn Summer in Berlin giveaway that I and several others have put together. I've partnered with Black Triangle Group and Kilo Tactical to offer a huge grand prize. The winner will receive Tradecraft tools and a Hunter Cat skimmer detector from Spycraft 101, 2 G10 composite blades and sheaths, plus a sear kit from Black Triangle, and several clothing and EDC items in East German Stricktarn camouflage pattern from Kilo Tactical. Altogether, that's 10 different prize items worth more than $600. To enter, just click the link in the show notes of this episode and leave your contact info. And make sure to follow Kilo Tactical and Black Triangle Group on Instagram as well. They're both making great products and great content that you won't want to miss. The deadline to enter is September 1st, 2024, so the clock is ticking. Mark, I'm glad we could get together again for this because I have not spent nearly enough time on events prior to World War II here on the podcast. So I know I've missed out on a lot of fascinating stories and lessons, and your new book is a perfect place to start.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to speak about a topic that I'm passionate about and has consumed almost 20 years of my life, actually.
Oh my gosh, wow. Amazing.
18. Yeah.
Was that all in service of this specific book, or just generally speaking, like your interest in all of this history in all its forms?
Well, sort of both, actually, in terms of my interest in World War I. Yeah, so this started, it has evolved a great deal since then, but this started actually as my PhD dissertation. And in 2006, I was entering a history program, a military history program, specifically at the University of Leeds in the UK. And I was kind of casting around for, what am I going to write about? And a mentor of mine, Dr. David Alvarez, suggested, well, why don't you do something with U.S. intelligence in World War I? And at that time, I didn't know much about World War I. And my immediate reaction was, that's a really silly idea. This must have been done to death, because I knew that World War II intelligence has been done not to death, but like extensively. Mm-hmm. And I just figured World War I was the same. I'd never really paid any attention to it. But I turned out to be completely wrong. And it turns out that aside from the issues of domestic surveillance during World War I, where there's a lot of literature, actually very, very little has been written about American intelligence during World War I. And furthermore, very little also has been written about sort of the transition from World War I into the interwar period and then, back to World War II again. And so I started working on this, and I began seeing a whole lot of continuities leading from, World War I to, frankly, even the kind of intelligence community that I worked in for 13 years. So that was kind of the genesis of the project back when dirt was young.
Wow. Very understandable. And that's fantastic to see it kind of grow and evolve, like you mentioned, into a full-fledged book like this. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I read a great deal of intelligence history, and yet almost everything in your book was brand new to me. So it was very refreshing to see something that I have not seen in any form in the past. And hopefully the listeners will get a lot out of that as well.
Well,
So,
that's one of the great things about World War One. U.S. intelligence. You can choose almost any way of slicing that topic, and it will be new. So it's
mhm,
very much a very open field. Anyway, sorry.
I believe it. So, on that note, because this is farther back than a lot of what I cover, most of my authors, and I believe you as well in the past, have had to go through some sort of like security review or something before you publish. But is that still true of information that's 100 plus years old at this point?
Yeah, I'm under a pre-publication review agreement, a lifetime agreement with the CIA. But you're absolutely right. That actually only applies to things that happened 1947 or after. And so I showed them the introduction and the final chapter, both of which briefly mentioned some, post World War II, Cold War kinds of things. And I told them, I can give you all the chapters in between, all the 100,000 words in between if you want. And they were like, thank you very much. We do not want to have those where you're actually talking about the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Mhm.
So it was not and the CIA didn't ask me to take out anything anyway. So it was, as a practical matter, it was a non-issue.
Okay, that's fantastic. That could be quite a hurdle, or at least a time-consuming part of this publication process, anyway, for a lot of people. So I'm glad that that didn't
Oh,
really
yes.
hamper you in any way this time. So the book starts. Of course, we're talking about World War One right here in the title and the intro and everything, but you actually start with the Civil War. So can you talk a little bit about something that really surprised me? Honestly, was that in the late 1860s and on, the U.S. military and their intelligence apparatus was very dysfunctional, apparently,
Oh,
especially
yeah.
compared to other nations, which kind of took me by surprise. I thought that war is such a great teacher that you would be pretty sharp at the end of it, but apparently that was not the case.
Yeah, so both the Federal Army and the Confederate Army during the Civil War built up quite sophisticated, intelligence capabilities. But you come to the end of the war, and obviously the Confederate states, like whatever they were doing, is not going to continue. Number one,
Right.
and number two, on the federal side, on the Union side, you've got this massive demobilization, right? Massive demobilization. And most of the intelligence activities, Grant, for instance, General Grant had a very good intelligence organization. Most of these activities were organized at the level of individual armies in the field, not at the War Department level in
Hmm.
Washington.
Okay.
And so when those armies got stood down and ceased to exist, if you were lucky, their papers got put in a box and sent to somewhere in Washington. But the ideas of how to do intelligence and many other things for that matter basically just got filed in Indiana Jones' warehouse and essentially forgotten. Certainly in an institutional sense, they were forgotten. So yeah, so between 1865 and 1883, the United States did not have any intelligence organizations in any meaningful sense. Now they did have a few naval attaches and army attaches, military diplomats basically in embassies and legations overseas, but not very many. And of course, they collect what we call overt human intelligence. But there wasn't a centralized, intelligence staff tasking them from Washington or analyzing and making any particular use of what they were sending back. So basically, as I say, we had no intelligence services between 1865 and 1883.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Understandable. So then, in 1883, which one emerges to begin with, and why did it emerge? I suppose.
Well, it was the Navy. The United States' oldest intelligence service is the Office of Naval Intelligence, which still exists and under that name, in fact. Yeah, and it was established in 1883. And it and the War Department one, which is going to follow shortly thereafter, come out of an environment of a network of certain officers in the Navy and in the Army start to be interested in, a military reform. Right. It's not just U.S. intelligence that's been in the doldrums since 1865. It's frankly the Army and the Navy writ large. And we've fallen very much behind the times. We are in no way, shape, or form peer or near peer competitors with the great powers of Europe. There was a reference work on navies of the world published in, don't quote me on this, but somewhere around about 1880 or so. And the United States was listed 19th in the world. The US Navy was listed 19th in the world after the navies of countries like Peru and Greece. So yeah, and so they started to say, look, we need to have modern militaries, like the countries that we look to as our peers in other regards. And intelligence was one component of that broader reform effort. And that was the real reason. So ONI was established in 1883, and the single biggest function they had for the next couple of decades really was collecting information on foreign naval developments. So they'd pay lots of attention to, like, breakthroughs in battleship armor and, new technologies for the engines that run warships and that sort of stuff, to then take that information, that technological information, and basically pump it back into the US Navy.
Okay. And as a brand new organization, did they experience a lot of growing pains, or were they just mirroring the British system, something like that? Or was it like tough going for a while for the initial plank owners?
Yeah, so O&I was not particularly influential, and they also had, over the years between 1883 and, say, when World War I started in Europe, they had some leaders who were pretty good, and they had some leaders who were pretty awful, and they were never very big. I mean, we're talking about at some points, a tiny handful. I don't recall precise numbers, but think in the order of half a dozen, kind of thing.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and also during the administration of President William Howard Taft, so he was big into dollar diplomacy, and during that period, the naval attachés who now reported to O&I, their big function was to sell U.S. stuff to foreign countries, not to collect intelligence. So that was sort of an added hurdle. So O&I never really had much clout during this period, and they suffered a lot from irregularly good leadership, I would say.
I see. And what about the Army? I mean, at what point did they start to get into the intelligence work as well?
Yeah, so the armies, and I'm just going to call it the Military Intelligence Division because that's what it was by the end of World War One. It's had a whole slew of names between 1885 and 1918. So I'll just say MID, or the Military Intelligence Division. It was established in 1885. They couldn't possibly let the Navy, best them. That would be just appalling, wouldn't it?
Hmm.
And they operated along similar lines, though there was less emphasis on technology acquisition. The Army is, at that time particularly, was not particularly high-tech service, just by nature of the beast. With a lot of effort on tactics and that sort of thing of foreign militaries. But the problem they really faced, it was somewhat different actually from what the Navy faced. The Navy faced it to some degree, but it was a big problem for the Army is, what the heck is our mission? Right. So during this period, of course, the American Indian Wars are still going on, but that frankly didn't draw a lot of, that was not a particularly large or taxing effort from the point of view of the War Department and the Army, right? And there weren't any particular interesting intelligence questions out there. It was mostly a matter of, cavalry scouting and sometimes use of Indian scouts, but it was not in any way, shape, or form cutting edge intelligence kinds of things. And it was really hard to imagine that, that we'd fight a war with Britain, or that somehow like Germany would sail across the ocean and land in New Jersey or something. So that was something that was holding back the Army generally and military intelligence because of it. Like, what war would we prepare intelligence for?
Right,
We
right.
can't imagine one. So yeah, at one point, one officer actually compared the Army at that time to firemen in the firehouse playing checkers, waiting for a fire to break out somewhere.
Oh, man.
And it's not happening. So that
Right.
that was a real problem for them.
I see. So were they also kind of relegated to the background by the Army bureaucracy of that time, like O&I was?
Yeah, I mean, they were also not particularly powerful, particularly in their initial years. They were buried way down in the bureaucracy, and they also just didn't have a lot of clout. That changes, of course, when we come to the Spanish-American War of 1898, though.
Right. Let's talk about that. That subject has not once come up on the podcast yet, so I'm glad to hear about a little bit about that from you.
Well, I'm not a deep expert in the Spanish-American War, except with regard to the intelligence aspects of it. But so Spain is viewed as in Washington as very much of a declining power, and there's an insurgency going on in Cuba against the Spanish, which is attracting a lot of sympathy from Americans and a lot of support from Americans. It becomes clear that there's a pretty good chance soon-ish that we'll fight a war with Spain. And the Military Intelligence Division in the War Department does a lot of preparation to prepare the kinds of information that you would want to have if you were going to operate an army in Cuba, and put together really comprehensive information on this. When the war actually breaks out, the Navy and the Army both put a lot of effort into espionage, actually in the run-up to the war and during the war, espionage against the Spanish, on various strategic matters, and also from the Navy's point of view, espionage, to try and figure out where the Spanish fleet is going to go. Because, of course, the concept here is that the U.S. Navy is going to carry the U.S. Army to Cuba and also Puerto Rico, by the way, in the Caribbean. If the Spanish fleet showed up to interrupt this, the U.S. Navy could end up at the bottom of the ocean, and that would be bad. So we want to find where the Spanish Navy is, was another big function of O&I. So there's all this preparation, and the head of the Military Intelligence Division, a guy named Colonel Arthur Wagner, who's really a pioneer in U.S. military intelligence, gets assigned as the Army representative to a two-person board, the other person being from the Navy, to develop the war plans. Because, like, he's got the data, right? His opposite number in the Navy in this effort to develop the war plans is not an intelligence person, but he is. Yeah, so they're very intimately involved. And something else you also see in the run-up to the Spanish-American War that has a whole lot of echoes with, later U.S. intelligence is Wagner at one point is invited to a meeting at the White House to discuss the impending war. So he's there with the president and the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy and other mucky mucks. And he tells the president, Mr. President, this would be a really bad time to go to Cuba this time of year because yellow fever is rampant there, and our troops are just not. That will do a number on our army. After the meeting, the Secretary of War is enraged by this, and after the meeting, he buttonholes Wagner and yells at him and says, "You're never ever going to get promoted again," which actually turned out not to be the case. But it was an effort at like politicization, of top-down politicization. Like that's a politically inconvenient message, and so we're going to tell you to change it. But to his credit, he stood his ground. Then when the war actually breaks out, though, the interesting thing is, as a practical matter, both the Military Intelligence Division in the War Department and the Office of Naval Intelligence essentially get disestablished. They get down both to, I think, one officer each.
My gosh.
Reservists, I believe. And all those officers are sent off to their regiments or sent off to ships and whatnot. And Arthur Wagner offers himself as the intelligence officer for the army that's going to go to Cuba. And the commander, Major General Shafter, wants none of it. That campaign in Cuba will be the last time the U.S. Army goes to war without an intelligence officer reporting to the commander. And Wagner gets his revenge later when he's asked to write a history and lessons learned of the campaign in Cuba. And he criticizes Shafter for all of his incompetence at, battlefield reconnaissance and intelligence and all of that. So,
yeah, probably very justifiably so, I'd imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed.
So Wagner was very fascinating character. You devote quite a bit of the book to him, in my opinion, and I was not familiar with him at all. He's an inspiring kind of guy in so many ways, pushing for change when no one else seems to really care. And I know how difficult it must be to push against that bureaucratic inertia in a lull between wars, but he was there right from the beginning, really, really pushing the envelope and innovating at a time when nobody cared about it. So I'm surprised I had not heard of him. Has he had any buildings named after him or anything like that you're aware of?
Not that I know of. Yeah, he is one of the great unsung heroes of the U.S. Army, I would say. He was, one of the very first, if not the first, sort of, warrior scholars or defense intellectuals or something like this, who really was pivotal, not only in helping the U.S. Army start to think in an organized fashion about intelligence, like with regard to battlefield intelligence, as opposed to the kind of intelligence in Washington, D.C. He actually writes a book on this subject. It's in 1893 called The Service of Security and Information, and it stays in print until into the 20th century and becomes a de facto doctrine. This is a period of time when the U.S. Army doesn't have, field manuals and that sort of thing as they do today. They've got field service regulations, or I forget the precise name, but regulations that cover things like how to march, how to handle your weapon, how to handle your rifle, but they don't have any kind of higher level doctrine formally. And so his book, published by a commercial publisher, becomes that for intelligence. And he also wrote a big, important book about military operations, which became the de facto, field manual on operations for the U.S. Army as well. And then he headed, as I say, a military intelligence division in the critical run-up to the Spanish-American War, and really prepared the Army well.
Well, that's a fantastic legacy, but it's unfortunate that he's so little known to this day, because as much as I read on this subject, I thought I would have run across him before now, but at least you're here to shed some light on him and redeem him in some way. So were the lessons that were learned? I mean, like you mentioned, the lack of an intelligence officer on the staff. Did those have consequences during the Spanish-American War? I mean, did we lose more casualties or have a more difficult time because of these oversights?
Yeah, the campaign in Cuba was a little bit blundering, I think it's safe to say. The force that went to Puerto Rico, which we also seized, did have an intelligence officer. Wagner managed to get himself hired there. That went pretty well. And then, of course, also the other big component was the Philippines. The Spanish were largely chased out of the Philippines as a result of a naval action, Admiral Dewey. But, of course, the army comes ashore and starts an occupation and starts, building institutions in the American style. And everyone had seemed to kind of imagine that the Filipinos would be perfectly happy to throw off their Spanish colonial masters and adopt new colonial masters who
Right.
were the Americans.
Right.
And oddly enough, a lot of Filipinos didn't feel that way. And so you get an insurrection that starts and lasts for, depending on how you want to count, is done in 1911, I believe. Used to be called the Philippine Insurgency. Now it's more commonly referred to as the Philippine-American War. This was really the first time that the U.S. Army had to deal with intelligence in support of counterinsurgency operations. And they did some really pretty high-speed things here. I mean, high speed for the time, right? And the most important of them was the use of cutting-edge information technology, the file card. So much like we've done in other counterinsurgency kind of conflicts, the army divided the Philippines up into various districts, right? And each district would have a U.S. Army unit that was responsible for keeping things under control in that area. And each of those had somebody who was the intelligence officer, and he would maintain card files. Imagine 3x5 or 4x6 file cards. He would maintain card files on the leading insurgents and influencers, if you will, in that region. And every time he added a new card, right, identifies somebody new, he would not only make a copy for himself and his local file, but he'd make another copy and send it to the next higher echelon of command so that they had visibility into what he saw. And anytime there were amendments, they do that too. So this creates a system where the top actually has a pretty good understanding of what's going on in an intelligence sense, at least, out in the grassroots where counterinsurgencies are really won or lost. That and other, operational and intelligence efforts were ultimately really quite successful and did well for the U.S. Army. There's a lot of people who argue then also that a lot of those ideas for how to conduct counterinsurgency intelligence actually got brought back and applied in domestic surveillance by the military during the World War I period. I think that's not entirely untrue. I think it's a bit exaggerated, but there's certainly some element of that. And really some of the big connective tissue there is a guy named Ralph Van Diemen, an Army officer named Ralph Van Diemen. And he was an interesting guy. He had a bachelor's degree from Harvard. And mind you, this is in a time when, well, in 1900 at least, I know approximately 3% of the US population had some college education, not necessarily a bachelor's degree, but at least had gone to college for one term or more, right? So it was very rare to go to college. So he was a Harvard man. And then he went to medical school at the University of Cincinnati and became an MD and was commissioned in the Army during that time. He'd been in the military intelligence division under Wagner, and then he went off to do intelligence work during the insurgency in the Philippines, where he becomes, he does good work there. And he also, by the way, becomes very seized of not just counterinsurgency intelligence, but also counterespionage. And he becomes very worried about the Japanese threat, perhaps more, in fact, I think probably more worried than the actual situation justified. But he brings this kind of counterinsurgency intelligence, counterespionage orientation, and a whole lot more intelligence experience than almost anybody probably in the Army has, except Wagner, who's actually dead by the time World War I comes along. And he's basically the guy who's going to be the keeper of the intelligence flame and, in essence, revive the military intelligence division after the U.S. enters World War I in 1917 from its technically on an org chart, it wasn't entirely it wasn't dead, but it was de facto dead, and he revives it and earns the moniker of the father of American military intelligence.
Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian-trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts. Yeah, they were very fortunate. I would imagine that they had several people at the right place at the right time to kind of weather the storm, the bureaucratic
Mm-hmm.
storm in a sense, and like just like you said, carry the flame forward, because we certainly had tremendous need of intelligence later on, and fortunately there were at least a few
Absolutely.
people doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So I want to jump forward a few years here to the Punitive Expedition, and that's another one that we haven't talked about before, but at least in my opinion, there's some absolutely riveting photos of intelligence work that came out of that Punitive Expedition. So I'd love to hear your take on all of that.
Right. So, of course, in 1916, Pancho Villa and his band raid an American town, kill a bunch of people, and skedaddle back over the Mexican border. And there's a great deal of outrage, and President Woodrow Wilson orders a U.S. Army punitive expedition to go to Mexico and bring justice to Pancho Villa. This is commanded by a guy named Brigadier General John J. Pershing. You may have heard of him. So he goes off to Mexico, and he actually brings with him a pretty broad suite of intelligence capabilities. So he's got the first Aero Squadron to carry messages, but also to do aerial reconnaissance. He's very much interested in seeing what the still pretty new airplane can do. Unfortunately, 1 month in, the last airplane ceases to be functional, but he writes glowingly of the commander of that squadron. And for a time, when Pershing goes to France for World War I, for a time, that guy is going to head his air service, a guy named Benjamin Fouloy. So he's learning a lot of lessons and becomes a big advocate of air power for intelligence. He's got some code breakers and signal intercept folks for people who have those skills. There's nobody who does that as a dedicated career in the Army at this point. And the punitive expedition actually is able to intercept signals not from Pancho Villa, who isn't really communicating on radios or anything like that, but from the Mexican government. The Mexican government also isn't very wild about Pancho Villa and would like to find him. And so when they communicate, often their communications will contain intelligence about where Pancho Villa is. And so Pershing's expedition was also exploiting that. He had all the usual sort of cavalry reconnaissance and infantry scouting and all that sort of stuff, which is, remember, an intelligence tool. And he also has an espionage and I would argue covert action capability. And at one point, he even tries to assassinate Pancho Villa. The punitive expedition has a couple Japanese spies working for them, and there's actually a significant Japanese population in Mexico. He's got a couple Japanese spies working for him who have access to Pancho Villa's camp. They're trusted there, and so and he's got an officer in his command who is highly unofficially offering $50,000, which is a lot of money in 1916, 1917, $50,000 for Pancho Villa's head. And so these Japanese spies would like to have that. As I say, they've got access to Pancho Villa's camp. And at one point, they poison Pancho Villa's coffee. And Pancho Villa does drink it and gets sick, but he doesn't die. And rumor of this filters back to Washington. And the Attorney General hears about this, and he asks the Secretary of War, hey, what's going on here? I'm hearing some stories that's, this doesn't sound kosher to me. And Secretary of War doesn't know anything about it. And so he cables a query to Pershing, like, what the heck is going on out there? And Pershing flat lies to him and says, ain't nothing happening here. I have no idea what you're talking about. He's got plausible deniability, as we would say in the covert action business these days. And he gets away with it. Doesn't kill Pancho Villa, though.
Incredible stuff.
And I guess I'd also just add then that I mentioned Benjamin Fouloy, but there were a number of other people involved in the intelligence effort, particularly on the human intelligence side, who he's going to take with him and put in his intel staff, in his G2, in the American Expeditionary Forces when that goes to France starting in 1917.
Right. This was I hate to use a positive term for, military action that resulted in a lot of casualties, of course, but it seems like a very, very positive testing ground for these brand new intelligence capabilities right there
It
on the southern
absolutely
border
was.
that
It absolutely was.
probably saved a lot of lives on the American side just a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And this this story about the four Japanese Mexicans who became a kill squad, essentially, just I'd never heard anything even remotely like that before. And I almost had to laugh, I have to tell you, Mark, because I believe one of them, and I'm definitely misstating his name, but it was like Juan Fucada or something like that, or Jose Fucada, like a
To be honest, I
Mexican
don't
first
recall
name.
at this point, but yeah.
Yeah, Mexican first name, Japanese last name, working for General Pershing against Pancho Villa. Just incredible stuff, really.
It's remarkable. I should say that I'm not the one who discovered that. That was actually discovered some years ago now by a couple of historians at the University of New Mexico
Hmm.
who wrote a lot about history and the military and also intelligence history, social history in that part of the world. But I have read the primary source documents on the subject, and they're remarkable.
I believe it. Yeah, one of the things I like about your book is you have so many notes at the end, and this story and a few others in the book. I stopped reading, I flipped to the back, I found the original source, and I looked it up as quick as I could. But a lot of this stuff is straight out of the National Archives, so there's no way for me to look for it. But
Yeah, I did a lot of work in the National Archives at College Park, and the Naval Intelligence records from that period are at the National Archives in Washington
hmm,
D.C., the original National Archives building. But I was also fortunate at that time, given the work I was doing in my real life at the time. I was being sent on business trips to places like the Naval War College and Fort Leavenworth out in Kansas and other places. And I would always see, are there archives there in, special collections in the libraries or that sort of thing that might have materials that would be useful to me. And I got a lot of really useful stuff too, particularly from the library of the Naval War College, and even more so from the library at Fort Leavenworth, which has remarkable holdings from that period.
I'll bet it does. Yeah, that's fantastic. You had an opportunity to go out there for other reasons as well, and kind of
Yeah, I was very fortunate.
terrific. So, like we said, all of this was kind of preparing, I guess maybe unknowingly preparing the U.S. for entry into World War One. So, did how did all of this actually work? Like, did the U.S. troops sort of hit the ground, or the U.S. intelligence, military intelligence, hit the ground running once they arrived in France, or was it an entirely new ballgame? Of course, against an entirely new enemy.
So when the United States actually declared war, ONI was functioning, and in fact, ONI had seen the writing on the wall and actually stepped up its espionage capability in 1916. The State Department actually concerned about German sabotage and subversion in the United States during that period when the war is going on in Europe, but we're still neutral. We haven't entered it yet. Creates its own intelligence capability, initially focused domestically on what the Germans are doing, but it ends up with the State Department doing espionage abroad. The War Department, however, as sort of alluded to, had in essence disestablished the Military Intelligence Division. But Ralph Van Diemen has a job on the staff that he's responsible for intelligence. Oh, by the way, a whole lot of other things too. But intelligence is his big love, and he's a big believer that it's important. And the United States enters the war, and the initial sort of view of the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, a general named Hugh Scott, who spent his operational career out west fighting Indians, was that, oh, hey, so we're going to France, we're going to be allies in essence with the British and the French, so they'll just they'll give us the intelligence we need to operate.
Hmm.
And the point is made to him that if there's some big disaster and there's some, I don't know, surprise attack and a huge number of American boys get killed, it will not look good to have to explain to the American public, and for that matter to the president, that we didn't have an intelligence effort to try and protect against these things, that we're depending on our allies to do that for us. And so the military intelligence division gets recreated, and that wasn't precisely the name, and Van Diemen is put in charge of it, and it grows like leaps and bounds here in Washington. And it does a lot of work too, once it can, to start training up officers to send to the American Expeditionary Forces in France. When Pershing initially goes to France in blanking on, is it May or June? I'm having a senior moment here, but of 1917, he brings his core staff with him. He brings an intelligence officer with him, a guy named Dennis Nolan, who's going to end up as a brigadier general. And Pershing thinks he's got some understanding of intelligence based on his, time in the Punitive Expedition, but he does actually, and he and Nolan, meet with before they actually start building forces. They meet with their opposite numbers and staffs, both on the British side and on the French side. And one of the things that the British and the French tell them is, you're going to need a really, really big intelligence effort here if you're going to have any impact on the battlefield at all. Your one guy is not going to cut it. You're going to need to build a big staff, and you're going to need to build a lot of infrastructure down through the forces. And so Nolan, with Pershing's backing, gets to work building that. And ultimately, the G2 of the American Expeditionary Forces numbers in the hundreds, and then G2 offices are set up in the U.S. First Army that gets created. Later, they create the Second Army as well, with about 2 weeks to go in the war. But also then in the divisions and the regiments and the battalions below that, it stood up very, very quickly, all things considered. But we were learning at a rapid clip from our British and our French allies. And in fact, one of the things that's really not appreciated, I think, by Americans, is the extent to which we learned about intelligence from the French. Like, we normally think about, our big mentors in the intelligence business were the British. And oh, by the way, that mostly happened in World War II and the early Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And we did learn a lot of, about intelligence from the British then. And we learned a lot about intelligence from the British in World War I. But we also learned a lot about intelligence from the French. And if anything, I would argue the French were more influential in helping the U.S. Army develop its understanding of intelligence, for the simple reason that, yeah, we had, a couple divisions that we loaned to the British, but the bulk of the American Expeditionary Forces were operating alongside the French on their left and on their right. The French staffs, Army level staffs, were the ones that, the AEF had to interact with on a daily basis about operational and tactical matters, not the British. And
Okay.
so obviously, if you're going to integrate with them, you probably ought to pay attention to how they operate. And at a time when we didn't have the field manuals and the technical manuals on intelligence written, you see a lot of these in the archives. There's a great collection at Leavenworth, and about intelligence matters, how to do this, that, or the other thing. And it'll say on the title page, translated from French.
Oh, I see.
and actually they it's just usually straight translations, and to be distributed to all the French armies. And it has all the verbiage that you'd expect the title page of a French manual to have. They don't even sort of swap that language out for American terminology and the American organization. But yeah, it's just straight translated from French. And here's how we're going to do photo interpretation, or here's how we're going to do, a range finding of enemy artillery. Or, these are hypothetical. I can't swear that those manuals specifically, but that you get the point. It's the bread and butter of everyday stuff that intelligence personnel at the tactical echelons have to do. Mostly comes from the French, translated from the French.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I understand that this is a rapidly growing organization. So consequently, you've got a lot of people that I assume have a level of training but no real experience in what they're doing. And
Yeah.
I also have to imagine this is vastly different than what anyone was doing with Pancho Villa, a highly mobile guy in an arid landscape, hiding among the population, versus this sort of static trench warfare environment that they found themselves in. So what were the actual priorities for military intelligence during the war? Was it like
Yeah.
artillery production or troop movements behind the trenches, something like that?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So the the first serious question that General Pershing poses to his G2 is nothing about what's going on the battlefield. It's actually a question about how big is the French supply of coal,
Hmm.
because there are rumors going around that France is about to run out of coal, and if they do, the French war effort comes to a grinding halt, and the Allies and the U.S. lose. And Pershing wanted to be in a position to know if that was going to happen, and be ready to take his force and beat a retreat to the ports, or whatever it is he's going to do in these circumstances. And so that's the first question they have to answer. And no, it turns out the French are not running out of coal. That was not a serious problem. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Western Front, until basically the last 100 days or so, was a pretty static, not entirely static, but a pretty static front line, running kind of a lazy S curve from the border of Sweden up to the southwest corner of Belgium. And, it didn't move rapidly until the last 100 days or so. And so there's a lot of effort, intelligence effort, put into studying the German trench system and following in detail the comings and goings of German units. And you put your finger on artillery, a very big effort on following artillery units around and also locating artillery batteries, German artillery batteries for, to either just attack them or for counter battery fire purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is an effort in which aerial reconnaissance, so the overall effort to sort of understand where the Germans are and understand their defensive system is something where aerial reconnaissance plays a very big role. And they start putting cameras on airplanes more or less immediately because the British and the French and the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, for that matter, were all doing that. And photographic intelligence from above provides more precise intelligence about precisely where the enemy is than any U.S. commander had ever had before. It's also a lot of uses made of intelligence interrogations of German prisoners, of reading captured German documents. And indeed, you see a lot, in war movies for that matter, about, patrols going out into no man's land during the night and that sort of thing. Routinely, the purpose of those patrols, which in the US Army at least were conducted by intelligence people, routinely the purpose of those patrols was to capture prisoners or kill stray Germans you find and take documents off of them. Communications and also direction finding are also, particularly direction finding, radio direction finding, are also very important in understanding the laydown of the German forces across the front. And then, of course, the British, the Americans, and the French, and actually also the Belgians, I believe, are all sharing this order of battle information with each other because a division that disappears from in front of the British over there may reappear in front of the Americans or French next week, right? Mm-hmm. So they're maintaining a common order of battle picture by sharing their unit identifications and locations, at least at the division level, across the Allied forces. So those are among the big purposes of intelligence sort of in France for in support of battlefield operations. Oh, and I guess the other thing I'd say is that back on aerial photography is it's not only useful for mapping the trench system and whatnot, which is not just helpful at the high headquarters levels. If you're going to attack, it's really useful for your battalion commanders, for instance, to have a good understanding of what's in front of them. What does the second line of German trenches look like? Oh, or there's a hill there. The infantry battalion commander on the U.S. side, about to attack, can't see over that hill, but the airplane can. So they produce photographs and maps based on aerial photography that again give American commanders at really all echelons a remarkably precise view of the terrain, the built terrain, i.e., the trenches and that sort of thing, and also the German units in it.
Okay. Would you say that was like the biggest success, adapting this new or embracing this new technology of aerial photography, for example? Is that the biggest success of the war for American?
I mean, I think putting it together putting all of these pieces together to create that picture of the battle space, as we would say these days, for American commanders, certainly is. And it's not sexy and exciting stuff. There is nothing in World War I intelligence for the Americans that's big and dramatic, like the signals intelligence success in the Pacific in 1942 that allowed us to ambush the Japanese Navy at Midway. Mm-hmm. There's nothing like that. This is day-to-day bread and butter kind of stuff. The kinds of intelligence you need to feed to an army to operate on a day-to-day basis in combat. Not super exciting, but think about if the American Expeditionary Forces didn't have that information, right? They'd have been near useless.
Yep. Absolutely.
In combating the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the big success for American intelligence comes in, I believe.
Yeah, critical stuff. And like you said, not really flashy other than the idea of, I guess, airplanes over the battlefield finally. But some of the photos you had, just guys printing up giant, blown up photographs and creating maps on walls out of them, and how, except that it's a map that's 1 hour old, for example. So you truly know what's going on.
It's really remarkable. You're referring to a photograph that's actually in the cover of my book as well as inside the book. Mm-hmm. An Army school for photography, which meant not only the technical sides of getting the photographs taken, but also photographic interpretation and making maps from photographs, was set up at Cornell University and trained a lot of U.S. officers who were going to be in air intelligence, basically.
Mm-hmm. Another great photo, I believe it was in your book as well, was the pilot, and he, as soon as he lands, he's handing off the film to a guy on a motorcycle, like a motorcycle courier that just pulls up right beside his biplane there, so they can get that film to the developers and the interpreters as quickly as possible.
Yeah, yeah. There a lot of effort went into making the photographic reconnaissance capabilities as speedy as they possibly could, as rapid a turnaround in the data and the analysis of what was on the photos as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Commanders then could be much more currently informed than they could have been in certainly in the Spanish American War or the Civil War. Now, by today's standards, information in World War I was coming to commanders very slowly, but by the standards of that time, this is super speedy,
Oh, right,
cutting edge stuff.
right, right,
So,
right. So by the time the war ended, I guess November 1918, was U.S. Army MI, was it a pretty like polished, well-rounded organization, or was it still in development, in flux, all the way up to the very end of the war?
well, I would say it was still constantly learning, and I don't think it was to the standards of the British or the French or the Germans for that matter, but it was entirely respectable. And it functioned well, actually. The intelligence for the American expeditionary forces functioned well. But we weren't on the steepest part of the learning curve, but we were still on a noticeably uphill part of the learning curve by the time the war ended. But we'd done good, in my view, on the intelligence side. We were in the war for as belligerents in the war for approximately 20 months. But in reality, we weren't in sort of any kind of serious, we were only rather in any kind of serious combat from the spring of 1918 to November 11th. Not a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, like new divisions are like constantly coming into France. And it actually works pretty well. There are certainly divisions and other units which don't use intelligence well, but looking at the overall system as a whole, it was pretty impressive. And it was built technically in 20 months, but as a practical matter, really more like in 1918. So yeah, the United States came out of the war, I think, could be justifiably proud of its military intelligence effort coming out of the war.
Yeah, certainly sounds like it. So did army, or well, did military intelligence experience that same sort of demobilization and brain drain that occurred so often in the past after the war ended, like through the 20s? Did it become a shell of its former self, or did they kind of maintain that legacy of professionalism?
Well, the answer is sort of. So certainly there was a massive demobilization of the U.S. military, the Army particularly, but also the Navy, after World War One, just like there had been after the Civil War, and just like after World War II, there's going to be one then too,
Mm-hmm.
and that affects both naval and military intelligence, but they don't go away. And in fact, on the with regard to the military intelligence division in the War Department in Washington, I ran the numbers, and the military intelligence division declined almost exactly in the same proportion to the total manpower of the U.S. Army. So they were retaining a core of people who knew how to do this, and also they kept most of the major functions in the interwar period, kept them puttering along, at a low level, but puttering
Mm-hmm.
along until we started to get serious about preparing for World War II. And, the doctrinal manuals and stuff that we'd taken from the French and also from the British were still in operation, but they got slowly rewritten over time. So there's a big doctrinal review in the early 20s that the U.S. Army does, or rewriting of the field service regulations. And it's all veterans of World War One. It's all people who've been like colonels and stuff in World War One who are doing this. And in fact, intel people are significantly overrepresented on this rewrite of the field service regulations. We fought with the Army, U.S. Army fought with field service regulations from 1916 with various new additions with like small amendments, but they're in the early 20s they did a total rewrite, and it was incorporating lessons from World War One. You can even look at doctrinal U.S. Army doctrinal manuals on a lot of things regarding intelligence from literally the eve of World War II, and you can see I saw that came in World War One, and we started doing this in World War One, and they're referring to this thing which happened
Hmm.
in World War One. The American intelligence DNA had been pretty much set, I think, and continued on through. And it's not just, of course, doctrinal manuals that continue. It's, some of the personnel, and also, officers are writing books. Intelligence officers are writing books, are writing articles in professional and also some general interest journals and magazines. So another big sort of conduit for bringing this experience forward. In 1918, the Military Intelligence Division in Washington decides that, like most of the other major parts of the War Department, it's going to write an official history of what we did during the war. Most of the components of the War Department had written kind of a House Beautiful version of it, right? That was, intended for public release. And like, we are great. See how great we are. The Military Intelligence Division decided to do something different. They decided to write a classified official history of what they'd done in one copy and keep it to inform their activities in the post-war period. And they did. It's about 2,200 pages.
Oh my
I've
gosh.
read most of them. Not necessarily the most exciting read, all of it, but it's very rich. And into the 1930s, new officers, when they reported for duty coming into the Military Intelligence Division, roughly speaking, the first week or so, a bunch of in processing, and also sit at your desk and read this official history. So these ideas carried through, and similar things going on with the Navy, naval intelligence. These ideas carried through from the signing of the armistice until Pearl Harbor Day, and the infrastructure got emaciated, but it continued to. U.S. intelligence did not start with World War II.
That's really good to know, because we needed our best guys and our best organization by the time we really got into that one. Of course, I'm actually kind of shocked, Mark, that they would. That's very, very progressive in a way, very forward thinking, that you would hand off this classified version to brand new people. That's something that kind of willing to face your previous failures and show that to the impressionable young up and comers. That's really fantastic, honestly.
No, that's a very good point. And I'm glad you mentioned failures, because, right, I mean, that was one of the reasons also to keep it classified, was so that they could really let it all hang out in this history. And I'm sure that a lot of the portions of this history, which were in the various chapters and sections, were written by the people who typically written by the people who had actually done it, right? There wasn't a one overarching author. And they talk a lot about in there about failures and about things that they suspected was going on, were going on, on the domestic side of, domestic surveillance, all that. It turns out not really to have been happening. And all of these sorts of things, it's not an unadulterated, we were great picture but at the classified level. It's pretty honest. They admit a lot of mistakes. As I say, I'm sure there's stuff that they left out.
Yeah, very,
but they
very
admit
impressive.
A lot of mistakes, and a lot of, they admit to a lot of kind of mediocrity. And, well, if we had to do this over again, we sure wouldn't do it that way. We recommend you do it this way. Mm-hmm. It's a remarkable document, actually.
Great news. That really is very impressive stuff. It's so hard for bureaucracies to face their own failures, or I should say organizations rather than bureaucracies. So they met it head on. Good. Well, Mark, this is a fascinating book, and it's a subject that I did not know very much about, and it sounds like a lot of people did not know very much about. So I'm really grateful for the years and years of work that you put into this to bring all of this to light in such a readable form.
Thank you. And I must say, it was a tremendous relief to finally see it in print.
I'll bet it was. So for the listeners, as always, of course, we have not covered more than a fraction of what's in the book. There's a lot of fascinating stories, just like the Pancho Villa poisoning story that I mentioned earlier that we discussed. There's some that we haven't gotten into at all that you're not going to want to miss. The book is World War I and the Foundations of American Intelligence by Mark Stout. And it's available now, as he said. Highly recommend you pick that up if you want to learn a lot more about where we all came from in a very real sense. So thanks a lot for your time, Mark. I really appreciate it. Can people connect with you online anywhere? Do you have a social media platform or websites, anything?
So my social media is on Blue Sky. I recommend that you all come to. And I'm at Mark Stout on Blue Sky. Okay. I do still have an account over on Twitter, but I don't use it anymore. So find me on Blue Sky.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. We will link that up in the show notes. And have you moved on to another project right now, or are you kind of basking in the glory of finally publishing?
Yeah, we don't do this for the glory, and we also don't do it for the money. Yeah, I am just beginning with a colleague of mine. I'm in the very earliest stages of actually a new book project. I've done the research, but actually started to get to we're working at the moment on a book proposal. And you mentioned the first time we spoke, episode 44, I think you said, where we spoke about this very strange espionage organization that the U.S. government had from 1942 to 1955 called the Pond, run by a highly quirky individual known as Colonel John Grumbach. Well, we're going to do that book.
Man, that is music to my ears, Mark. I'm so glad to hear that, because you have been just about the sole source besides Grombach himself, as far as I could tell. So I'm really glad to hear you're expanding. Has anything new come to light? Because I know that there just was not a whole lot of information available initially. I mean, you must have really been digging for this new project.
Yeah, not a lot new that we didn't have when we last spoke on this. Though I would say that as the World Wide Web continues to expand its reach, that I've been able to find more archival sources, every year since.
That's great
It's
news.
not been super dramatic stuff, but filling in some of those little details and stuff. As more and more university libraries put their special collections, finding aids online, allow various databases of archival stuff to list their stuff. But yeah, no, it's no big dramatic discovery since we spoke. It's just a question of got to do the book finally.
Well, it's a very exciting subject for me, and one I've revisited. And in fact, I just got a copy of Grombach's book maybe a month or two ago. I finally found a used copy on eBay, so I've got that on my bookshelf now as well.
Oh, is that The Great Liquidator?
Yes,
that's a quirky book.
Yeah, it's a very yellowed little paperback. I take it with a grain of salt, of course, because you mentioned that quite a bit in our first interview, I think. But I'm glad to have a copy of my own.
Yeah, congratulations.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. I really appreciate it. And I recommend this book wholeheartedly to everyone listening.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun.
Always. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.